everybody. Today I want to talk to you about the stages of clay. Now, there's a lot of different variations in how you would define these, but for me I'm focusing on 6 main stages. We have unfired stages and 2 fired stages. So let's take a look. To start with, I'm going to begin here with stage 2. This clay is called plastic. That's because this clay is moldable and malleable, and the word plastic means moldable, malleable, shapeable. This is the clay that we want to work with most of the time. This is how the clay should feel when it comes out of the pug mill or fresh after wedging or kneading the clay. And this is how clay comes right from the factory when I purchase the clay. Sometimes when it sits longer, it gets a little bit stiffer than we really want. You as a ceramic artist can have some control over this. Depending on what you're trying to create, you might want softer clay or firmer clay. This stage is called plastic. Now, we could go backwards to this. This is called slip. So slip is a thin liquid mixture of clay. And this is really stage 1. And the reason why we call it stage 1 is because it is the wettest stage of clay. Basically, we're going from wet to dry as we move across the first 4 stages. Then we're looking at the effects of firing after that. So slip in its liquid state is used primarily for adhesion. So if I want to attach 2 pieces of clay, I'm going to score or scratch the surfaces and then brush on a little bit of slip. At a microscopic level, those little clay particles get all in there and kind of help adhere permanently the 2 parts of your piece. Slip can also be used for surface decoration. Some potters will brush colored slip right on the pot while they're on the wheel. Sometimes you can put a layer of colored slip on top of clay and carve right through the surface. Or maybe wet slip can be added to create texture on the surface of a pot or a sculpture. There's also something called slip trailing, where you put slip in a little squeezy bottle and you trail it out onto the surface of a sculpture or a pot to create a permanently fired texture. Another way that slip is used is through slip casting. So imagine you have a plaster mold and you fill that up with liquid slip, you allow it to set up a little bit and pour out the excess. That's how a lot of factory-made ceramics are created. So, the second stage of clay is the one we previously mentioned, plastic. This is primarily the clay we're going to use when we start a new project. Basically, some of the water has evaporated out of this clay. Clay particles at a microscopic level are slightly closer together. It's a little bit more dense. But there's still enough water in there to be able to easily manipulate this without much cracking. When the clay starts to dry a little bit more, the projects get a little bit firmer, a little bit sturdier. Eventually, they dry enough to be what's considered leather hard, like this scrap of a pot here. Leather hard means it is slightly flexible. Think a thick leather belt. But it's very firm and sturdy. I can hold this without much fear of it falling apart. This is the primary stage as you finish and refine a project. And for example, if you ever want to transport a project, you want it to be leather hard, because at the leather hard stage, you can still repair the clay. Basically what's happened here is more water has evaporated out from the clay and the particles are a little bit closer together and less likely to want to slide around. Now, technically, you could break down leather hard into soft leather hard, and hard leather hard. Anytime you are adhering a piece of clay to a leather hard piece, you need to score and slip whatever clay is leather hard. Hard leather hard, however, is really too stiff to work with. You don't want to let that happen. Hard leather hard would crack if I were to do a bend test. And it's a little bit harder to repair. So you never want to let your clay get to that stage. Eventually, though, you're going to move on to that next phase only when you're finished a project. When you're done, your work is going to become bone dry. This is what it looks like when it's on its way. It's a little bit lighter in color compared to the leather hard, but it would definitely crack and break if I were to bend it. And at this stage, repairing it is really risky. If you add water to this, chances are that water might just slake the clay down and cause it to break further. Fully bone dry clay is light and chalky in color, and it is brittle. This stuff is so breakable. We want to be careful at this stage too, because dust is the biggest health hazard when working with clay. So we don't want to generate any dust when we work. Bone dry clay really should not be touched, handled, or transported. However, it can be really useful if you're making slip. Save those little scraps of bone dry clay and you can just put it in some water and it'll melt down into slip very easily. What's really important to know with this bone dry phase, bone dry clay cannot be repaired if it breaks. So the idea here is in my studio, when you're done a project, we maintain it at leather hard. We turn it into the drying rack when it is leather hard, and then nobody touches it but me. It can dry safely in the kiln room away from anybody. When the projects have fully dried, and I usually let things dry at least a week, they can go into the kiln and be fired. The first firing is called the bisque firing, and that's what this stage is. So there's a big change that happens here. All of this is clay. Once you pass this phase, once clay is fired, it is not clay anymore. It is a new material called ceramic. What happens here is the clay vitrifies. Now the first firing is only a measly 1,850 degrees Fahrenheit or so. Sometimes that is referred to as cone 05. We'll talk about that in a second. But at this phase, you can tell by that sound it is partially glass-like. So some of the clay particles have fused together and formed molecules of glass. Some of the clay particles are still kind of in there, trapped in between. This clay is ready to glaze. It is still delicate. I would not want to pick a mug up by its handle at this phase. If you break a bisque-fired piece, it cannot be repaired. And if I were to put this in water for 10,000 years, it's not turning back into clay. It's permanent once you have fired it. So if you mess up at this phase, you really have to start with new clay and a new project. You can't fix this. At this stage, the clay is very porous. It has many tiny microscopic holes in it. And that's kind of the idea, because we want the glaze to stick when we apply it. So by having such a porous clay body, when I brush that glaze on, it will dry easily and quickly. Then this will dry out a little bit and it'll go back into the kiln for the final firing. Our last stage is referred to as a glaze fired or final fired form. So take a look. This is a cone pack. Inside of here are these little cones, and it's just pressed into this little boat of clay. Now a cone pack is how you measure if a kiln has fired correctly. So I put these little cones in there. This is cone 5 and this is cone 6. So once I reach enough temperature over time, the cone is designed to melt. And that melting tells me the right amount of heat work has been accomplished. Think about a recipe. I'm actually really terrible at baking cookies because I tend to overcook them slightly. The thing is, if you were following a recipe for cookies, it wouldn't say, put it in the oven at 350. It would say, put in the oven at 350 for 10 minutes. So this measures two things, not just temperature, but time. This measures the work that heat does over time. And when I program the kiln, it has a little computer on it where I can tell it to go to cone 5. What that means, it is going to slowly heat up all the way until about 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit to reach that level. This, you might remember, is called cone 05. That's because the cone scale kind of starts below 0, so to speak, so 05, 04, 03, 02, 01, cone 1, cone 2, cone 3, cone 4, cone 5, and so on. Some potters fire all the way up to cone 10. In this studio, we go with what's called mid-fired or cone 6, and we can get a beautiful glazed result. At this stage, the glaze that we had brushed onto the surface has melted to become a coat of glass. If you use the right glaze and make it the right way, it can be food safe, microwave safe, dishwasher safe, and the true color comes out in the kiln at this phase. This clay is very sturdy. If you had a handle, you can hold it by that. You don't have much risk of breaking it other than, normal china. Like if I drop it on the floor, it's gonna break. The clay is very dense. It is glass-like. That means it has vitrified fully. That means at the microscopic level, there are lots of little tiny bits of glass holding everything together. The clay at this stage is this nice toasty brownish red for the type of clay that we are using in the studio. And notice it is not that same peachy color it was when it was first bisque fired. Clay at this final fired stage is also not absorbent anymore. It's very dense. So even if it's not glazed at all, water is not going to tend to soak into this. That means it is finished, ready to be used as sculpture or as a functional piece of pottery. So big picture, as we move through the first stages of clay to this level, water is evaporating. we're losing water. Water is going away. As we move from this to this to this to this to this, isn't there less stuff? The water is gone. H2O is removed. What this means is technically it's getting lighter. That's true. If I started with 100 grams of clay, I'm going to have less than that over here. But the important connection for us is to think about what's happening. Those clay particles are spread apart with water in between them down here. As the water evaporates, the clay particle... I know what... way that... As the water evaporates, the clay particles get closer and closer together. What this means is clay shrinks. As clay dries, it shrinks. Our clay that we use from the working stage all the way to finished shrinks 10%. It means if I made a little cup 10 centimeters high when it's here, it's going to come out 9 centimeters high here. Now, that's nice to know because if I'm making a mug, I might make it the tiniest little bit oversized so that when it's fired, my hands fit it nicely. But more importantly, we want to avoid any cracks or damage to your project as it dries. In fact, if you dry clay too quickly, it's going to crack in the drying. If you dry it a little bit too quickly, it might crack in the firing. The number one cause of issues with clay, projects breaking or cracking, is drying too fast or drying unevenly. Take this mug for example. That handle is going to dry before the rest of the mug. So what I want to do is loosely cover this when I'm first finished and allow it to dry more slowly. But more importantly, think about how you're creating a project. This pinch pot example here is equal thickness all the way from the bottom to the rim. That means it is all going to dry at the same rate. The most common problem students encounter is that the bottom of a pot is too thick and then the rim is too thin because you can see that and pinch it easily. What's going to happen is you're going to get a crack on the bottom. No matter what, the bottom's going to dry slower because it's thick and the rim's going to dry faster because it's thin. So the fundamental that you have to consider during every project you make, equal thickness is the goal. Equal thickness is the goal. You're going to have stronger, nicer looking pots, but more importantly, they're more likely to survive the drying and the firing. In addition to that, imagine I have created a sculpture, maybe something that is large and thick. Well, if that happens, you have to get in there and hollow it out. It has to be allowed to dry, and it has to be even thickness. Now, you could have a pot that's a little thicker or a little thinner, as long as it's even, that is what matters. So guys, if you really understand the stages of clay and how water affects it at every level, and how you can wrap your projects and protect them or add water intentionally to keep the clay at the stage you want it to be, here, plastic and leather hard, that's where you want it to be until you're done, you can be a lot more successful. If you notice your project is hard to work with, it's a little stiff, maybe wrap it in a slightly damp paper towel, then in plastic. But if you forget to cover something, or if you just leave it out too long, you could go past that stage into the point of no return. So pay attention to the stage of clay that you're on, understand what changes as you move, and you're going to be much more successful with your work. So guys, take this knowledge and prosper. That was a stupid ending. Clay. No. The end. Guys, take this knowledge and grow. Okay. Bye.